What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my Paladin build for Baldur's Gate 3. As I have been playing through the game for a review, making builds for all of the playthroughs I plan on doing, and to that end, this is a build I plan on using for Wyll specifically as a companion, though I will go over some options to use this as your main character as well. And while I have not completely done this as a full playthrough as the main character yet, I have used this on Wyll as a companion for a playthrough, and thus have tested it pretty thoroughly. But first, we're going to talk a little bit about an overview and then get into the multiclassing. So while this is a Paladin build, in my opinion, we are making use of a couple of multiclass options to make us an incredibly heavy hitter in melee combat, while also getting access to some of the more useful defensive features from the Paladin class, as well as some of the useful spells from a Warlock. And just for good measure, we're going to be picking up the fighter's action surge while we are at it. But the primary purpose of this build is just to do as much melee damage as possible, while also giving ourselves a few other options to use in specific situations. That said, let's talk about the multiclassing, because this is where the build gets a little tricky. While we're going to be using a number of strong individual classes that will make leveling up much easier, the build does not completely come together until pretty late into the game. And because of the way we are multiclassing, we're going to have a few different options in terms of leveling up that we're going to discuss. For the multiclassing portion of this video, I want to explain what we're picking from each class and why. So ultimately, our split will be 5 levels of Paladin, 5 levels of Warlock, and 2 levels of Action Surge. The 5-5 Paladin Warlock split is simply because we are taking advantage of a stacking effect from Pact of the Blade on the Warlock side of things that ultimately gives us 3 attacks. Right away, the only reason I'm making the build with this now is because with patch 1 having just been delivered at the time of this video, and them not having addressed this, I think it's safe to say it's going to stick around for a little while, at the very least. But Warlocks get a feature called Pact of the Blade that at level 5 grants them an extra attack like any other martial character would get. Typically though, the extra attack that martial characters get at level 5 does not actually stack with other classes' version of it. The fact that Pact of the Blade does is both very convenient for us, but also a little odd, because theoretically it shouldn't. However, given that they just haven't fixed this yet, and it's a pretty well-known thing, we're using it here. But for the sake of completeness, in the event that happens to have been changed, all we're going to do is slightly adjust the level spread here and get essentially the same effect minus an extra attack. At which point our spread would be 7 levels of Paladin, 3 levels of Warlock, and 2 levels of Fighter, because the only reason we're going to level 5 of Warlock is specifically for that extra attack. We don't need it for anything else. We're taking the 2 levels of Fighter because Action Surge is incredibly useful and there's just no reason not to use it here, and it adds quite a bit to this build. So with that in mind, let's talk about character creation, or respecking Wyll, basically. If you plan on using this build for Wyll, character creation, if you're playing as Wyll, is pretty straightforward. A lot of the decisions are set in stone, you can't change much, and you're going to be forced to start the game as a Warlock as well. Which brings me to my first point about character creation here. We need to decide if you want to level up as a Paladin or a Warlock. Starting the game as a Warlock is okay, we just won't get access to heavy armor until very late in the game. And it's going to be a little bit of a different level up experience as opposed to starting as a Paladin, who will get heavy armor, but also won't be able to make use of the Pact of the Blades extra feature that grants us our Charisma ability score for our attack rolls until much later. So the trade-off there is, do you want the Charisma to attack faster, or do you want the heavy armor out of the gate? We're going to wind up getting heavy armor no matter what, thanks to a specific item we'll pick up in Act 3, but that's the main trade-off here. Another thing to keep in mind is that because we are not getting the Charisma to attack if we start as a Paladin and take that to level 5, you might be a little underpowered in terms of hitting things, especially if you're on Tactician right away. So the workaround here would be to, in that case, if you want to start as a Paladin, put a bunch of points into Strength and Dexterity that we will then later respec into Charisma once we can make full use of it. That's a little metagamey though, and not going to be for everyone. You could also just take 14 Dex like I'm about to talk about and use a Dexterity or Finesse weapon until you get your charisma to attack, which wouldn't be ideal, but it would work, especially if you're just on normal. So if you choose to start as a warlock, we're going to pick up the Fiend subclass for the Dark One's Blessing at level 1. This is going to give us extra hit points when we kill something, and the spells at this level don't particularly matter, but for cantrips we definitely want Eldritch Blast, and Wyll has the folk hero background by default. Now on the flip side of that, if you wanted to start as a paladin, I would pick the Oath of Vengeance, which would require a custom character, to be clear, as Wyll cannot start from anything besides Warlock without respecking him later into the game. But if you want to start as Paladin with a custom character, just pick up Oath of Vengeance. That one is usually the easiest to play, and kind of thematically in line with what we want to do here, but realistically, the Oath actually wouldn't matter much. It's not going to make much of a difference. And in my personal opinion, Oathbreaker is actually the perfect option for us, which you cannot pick at character creation. Beyond that, for a custom character, the race won't matter too much, but technically Half-Orc would be the best option, as their Savage Criticals feature is really, really good for this build. So if you want to min-max, that's really your best option. And then the background for a custom character also wouldn't matter much. It's kind of just dealer's choice there. Last but not least, for character creation, let's talk ability scores. Now, regardless of whether or not you start as Wyll or a custom character, you will be able to change these in character creation. But if you're putting this on Wyll as a companion, you will have to respec his ability scores for it. In any event, I personally enjoy putting Strength, Intelligence, and Wisdom at 10, with Dexterity and Constitution at 14, and Charisma to 17. Eventually, all we're going to be focused on is Charisma. Constitution is going to give us a little more health, and Dexterity is primarily going to be a bonus to our initiative, especially later in the game when we're not using it for anything. If you're starting as Warlock, this is absolutely what you want to use, and if you're starting as Paladin, you might consider using this as well, but we will have a lower chance to hit. If you're starting as Paladin, consider pumping up Strength or Dexterity a little more to make sure you can actually hit the things you are trying to hit in melee. But ultimately, this is going to be the spread that you get, which is going to allow us to make use of a Hag Hair quest reward to increase our Charisma to 18, and then take it to 20 later on. With our multi-classing, we're going to get 2 ability score improvements, one of which we're going to use on a feat, and really all we need here is 20 Charisma anyway. But this should be about what it looks like. Now, moving on to leveling up, this is a little tricky because depending on how you start and how you choose to level up, the exact level at which you take something is going to vary. So we're going to break this down by class this time instead. We can either start as a Paladin or a Warlock, but in any event, we need to get both of them to level 5, and we want to do that consecutively, so we can get our extra attack as early as possible, which will make playing through the early game that much easier. So you'll take either Paladin or Warlock to level 5, then do the one you did not start as to level 5, and then we'll take Fighter last. To that end, let's talk about Paladin first. Paladin's going to grant us a few things right out of the gate. For starters, at level 1, we get access to Lay on Hands and Inquisitor's Might if you went Oath of Vengeance, which will give us extra damage for a few turns as a bonus action. At level 2, however, Paladins get their most useful stuff via a Fighting Style and Divine Smite. Divine Smite can potentially add extra damage to our weapon attacks and does extra damage against fiends and undead, which this game has plenty of. Divine Smite is incredibly strong. For our fighting style, I recommend you pick up Great Weapon Fighting, as we're going to be using two-handed weapons. Levels 3 and 4 of Paladin are not particularly interesting, but at level 4 we get a feat or an ability score improvement depending on which one you want. If this is your first of the 2 we are going to get, I recommend taking Charisma up to either 19 or 20 depending on whether or not you got the Hag Hair quest reward from Act 1, which will bring it up to 18. But either way, we want to pump up Charisma here. Level 5 of Paladin is going to grant us extra attack, which is the main thing we want there. That's pretty much it for Paladin, so let's talk about Warlock now. At level 2, we pick up some Eldritch Invocations. We're going to pick up Agonizing Blast and Repelling Blast. This adds our Charisma modifier to our Eldritch Blast damage, and Eldritch Blast is one of the best cantrips in the game and can deal a ton of damage. Repelling Blast makes it possible to push enemies back and knock them off a ledge or something, so this is going to be very useful to us in certain situations. So these first invocations here are pretty important. For level 3, we pick up the most important part of our Warlock side of things though, which is Pact of the Blade. This allows us to use Pact of the Blade, giving us our Charisma modifier as our attack modifier for our attack attacks, giving us the ability to put everything into charisma and not have to worry about strength or dex to hit, which makes our life much easier, as all of our spells will now work off of this as well. Plus, while it is not explicitly stated as part of the description here, at level 5, Pact of the Blade also gives you extra attack that stacks with the Paladin's extra attack, like I mentioned in the multi-class section. For the spell at level 3, I recommend Cloud of Daggers, as it's very fun. For level 4, this will be our second feat or ability score improvement. I like to take Savage Attacker. Whenever we make a melee weapon attack, we'll roll our damage twice and use the highest result. This means we're always going to be dealing higher damage than we might have normally, and makes it that much more likely we see those big numbers. Also, because we're using Charisma for everything and it should be at level 20 by the time you get this second one, we simply don't need our ability score improvement for anything else. Level 5 for Warlock is purely just the extra attack from Pact of the Blade, which brings us to our 2 levels of Fighter. Level 1 of Fighter, we're going to get to pick another fighting style. We're going to grab Defense. This is going to give us a +1 to our AC, which is just generally useful because we don't need the other ones. And then at level 2, we get Action Surge, which allows us to take an extra action. And seeing how we'll have 3 normal attacks for our regular action, if we choose to attack, this effectively allows us to make 6 attacks per round. At, however, level 12, which is why a lot of this doesn't come completely together until towards the end of the game. So that's pretty much what to expect leveling up. It will change a little bit depending on exactly how you want to do it, but that's the important stuff. Now, when it comes to equipment, there's a few things to keep in mind, though the nice thing about this build is that it's not really gear dependent at all. Pretty much everything we're picking up is from our classes and everything kind of meshing together appropriately. So we don't need to worry about exactly what gear we're using, but in any event, there's still some really good stuff that I want to mention. For our hat, I wouldn't worry about this too much until you get to Act 3, but in Act 3 at the Sorceress Sundry shop, you can buy the Birthright cap, which will bring Charisma up to 22, which is incredibly useful for us. Then for our chest piece, there are 2 I would recommend. The best one is also an incredibly late game item from the House of Hope called the Helldusk Armor. If you plan on starting as a Warlock, this one is going to give you heavy armor proficiency anyway, all by itself, because this armor just grants heavy armor proficiency if you do not have it. It's also an incredibly high AC item and reduces damage, plus gives you the Fly spell. Pretty much the best heavy armor in the game, and arguably the best armor in the game, period. But that's super late in the game, so before that, I recommend grabbing the Adamantine armor, the Splint armor specifically that you can craft in the Adamantine Forge in the Underdark late into Act 1, which will carry you through pretty much the rest of the game until you get to Helldusk. Another important one is the Disintegrating Nightwalkers. This makes you immune to Enwebbed, Entangled, Ensnared, and you can't slip on grease or ice, plus gives you a free cast of Misty Step. Just a fantastic pair of boots for any melee character, really. And we also find these in the Grim Forge or the Adamantine Forge area of the Underdark as well, where it drops off an enemy known as Near. For our ring, there's one I would recommend, which is Killer's Sweetheart, which drops in the Gauntlet of Shar in Act 2. The Executioner ability is very useful because when we kill something, it can turn our next attack roll into a critical hit once per long rest, which is just going to give us nice damage. For our weapon, realistically, the best two-handed weapon you can find is going to do it for you. The Everburn blade that you can get right in the tutorial is fantastic. That'll carry you through the early game. The Soulbreaker Greatsword from Act 1 as well, though right at the end of it in the monastery, is also fantastic. The final one that I really enjoy for this build is actually the Corpse Grinder Maul that drops off an enemy in the Worm's Crossing area of Act 3, mostly just because I feel it suits this build really, really well, and it also has a big area of effect pushback attack that you can use, which is fun to mess around with. Realistically though, again, any two-handed weapon that has high damage is gonna do it. Beyond that though, again, this build will work very well with just the best equipment you can find. You don't necessarily need anything specific because everything we need we're getting from our class features, so it is not necessary to use any fantastic equipment outside of what's gonna give you the best defense and the highest damage. With that in mind though, if you're looking for a little extra edge and you want to dabble in the Illithid powers, the best two for this bonus are, as for most builds, Favorable Beginnings and Luck of the Far Realms. Favorable Beginnings gives us a bonus to our first attack or ability check against a target, and then Luck of the Far Realms allows us to guarantee a critical, which can just be really, really strong. And it's possible to use Luck of the Far Realms in combination with things like Killer's Sweetheart or a couple other items to basically just force critical hits, which is fantastically strong for any build, but this build as well because we're getting so many hits in as it is. So something to keep in mind there. Moving on from there to our last section, let's talk a little bit about combat. If you're leveling up as a Paladin, you'll kind of get the gist of this in a simple form all the way from the early game, as our goal in combat is to basically just hit things in melee and let Divine Smite add on that extra damage, and that in combination with our extra attacks is pretty much going to do most of the work for you. You just got to get close and hit things, which can be made easier with spells like Misty Step, but basically the goal is to just hit things in melee. If you choose to start as a Warlock, your early game is going to be a little more spell focused. You're probably going to be leaning on Eldritch Blast a lot, while also trying to crowd control things with spells like Cloud of Daggers. Once you get your Paladin levels and you can start hitting things with Divine Smite with a two-hander, that's pretty much our goal. And then once we get our last couple levels of Fighter and we can use Action Surge, we can take even more attacks, or potentially even a spell in the right circumstances, and deal even more damage. But our goal is to basically just hit things as much as possible in melee. But while it might initially seem like this build has the weakness of not being able to cover enough ground very quickly, that is where the more spellcastery side of our abilities comes in, because remember, Eldritch Blast is still going to be really strong with this build. Because we've got Agonizing Blast, granting it our Charisma modifier to its damage, you can add Repelling Blast to knock enemies back. The Warlock at level 5 will still get spells like Cloud of Daggers, as I mentioned, and Hunger of Hadar, which can slow down enemies and sort of root them in place by making it difficult terrain and blinding them. Even in the event that you cannot reach the enemy to unleash all these melee attacks, we can still deal damage and control the battlefield via some of our support spells. Though, again, our primary method of damage here is all of the attacks. And that's before you even start adding things like haste, etc. that will grant you extra actions that you could take even more attacks with. So ultimately, combat comes down to, can I reach the target to hit them? If no, can I lay down a spell or hit them at ranged that will make their life more difficult? And as such, whether you're playing this character as your main character or you've put it on Wyll as a companion, it plays a really fantastic role in any party. But if it's your main character, because of all of our charisma, it also makes a fantastic face character to do all of your talking as well. But in any event, that's pretty much going to do it for this video. I certainly hope you enjoyed it. If you mess around with this build or you try it out, I'd love to hear what you think of it, which of course means to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.